This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, begins today's show discussing the upcoming regulation changes to the Horse Protection Act. He explains the revisions for horse events and owners. Continuing the show is K-State veterinarian Gregg Hanzlicek talking about a cattle disease, Theileriosis. Gregg explains how it will likely come to Kansas and what cattle producers can do. The Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White and Bob Larson with special guest Scott Fritz in today's show with part of their Cattle Chat podcast discussing grazing crop stubble. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking about the Horse Protection Act with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
Roger, talking about the Horse Protection Act and new regulation that will be coming into effect February 1st, but first, backtracking back to 1970 and what was the Horse Protection Act?
Well, it was intended to end the inhumane practice by owners and trainers and exhibitors of deliberately making sore the feet of a Tennessee walking horse. So it was restricted to the Tennessee walking horse aspect of the equine industry. And those are the type of horses that you'll see in parades and shows. They're characterized by the high step of their forelegs, so they really pop them up high. It looks really cool on TV or when you're there watching it. But the problem that Congress was trying to legislate out of existence was the practice of trainers of those horses, soring them, either by applying chemicals or by placing some type of painful collar around the top of the horse's hoof that would cause the animal to step up in that pronounced manner. So it really wasn't training Congress was fearful of and was being told at the time, that some of that's not happening just because of good training. That's happening because there's pain associated with the horse putting pressure on its hoof, and so it pops it up real high. And so the Congress outlawed in the Horse Protection Act those procedures and made it an inhumane practice if it was done in interstate commerce. And, of course, that triggers some pretty severe penalties. And then they made this provisions even stronger in 1976. So it doesn't prohibit, so to speak, the soring of horses, but it does prohibit a sored horse from being entered into horse shows, exhibitions, sales, auctions, and moving in interstate commerce, or substantially affecting commerce. That's the legal lingo there on that one. And they extended it in 1976 to intrastate commerce inside a single state. So, it doesn't outlaw the practice, but if you do it, you're going to lose a lot of value as to why you have a Tennessee walking horse. So you're going to be disincentivized from doing it.
Roger, what change are we seeing then here in less than a month?
Well, starting February 1, USDA and their sub-agencies have some new rules that are going to take effect, and these actually came down May 8 of 2024, so we know they've been out there a while, but now we're getting close to the effective date of these rules. And these are the result of some animal activists that are wanting more regulation of the Tennessee walking horse industry and expanding the definition of soring to encompass as much of the entire horse industry as possible. So now we're starting to move beyond just Tennessee walking horses to all types of horses, and that's despite the compliance rate historically with the Horse Protection Act over 90%. So there's really not much of a problem here, and certainly not the level of problems that would warrant expansion of this beyond just simply Tennessee walking horses.
And Roger, you wrote a blog article on this, and within this article you have quite a few bullet points of significant changes, and one of those bullet points, event management responsibilities, and what changes have happened there.
Right. If you're a horse event manager, then you have to notice, under these rules, if they take effect as scheduled on February 1, you're going to have to notify the USDA's APHIS, their Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, at least 30 days before the event, indicating whether you have appointed a USDA horse protection inspector or requested an APHIS veterinary medical officer to conduct inspections. So now you got to have everything inspected. You're going to have to notify USDA that, you've got qualified people lined up to do that. You have to notify them 30 days before your event. And then any event update has to be provided 15 days in advance, and the managers then would have to report any violations to the regional director of APHIS within 5 days after the event concludes. And you also have to identify, as the manager of the event, the identity of each horse entered at a show, exhibition, sale, or auction, and maintain all horse show and exhibition records for 90 days and make those records available to inspectors. So those responsibilities fall on event managers.
What are qualified personnel for the horse protection inspector or APHIS veterinary medical officer?
Well, they have to be licensed veterinarians or individuals with extensive equine experience, and they're going to be responsible for doing the inspections at events. And the associated, as I see it, problem with this is at the same time all these new rules are coming into place, and you've got to have your veterinarians inspect these horses and so forth. They're discontinuing under these rules what's known as the Designated Qualified Person Program and the role of horse industry organizations in inspections. That's all going to be discontinued. So only your APHIS veterinary medical officers and HPIs are going to be able, your horse protection inspectors are going to be able to conduct inspections. So that's going to thin the available pool of inspectors at a time when you have more requirements and time frames put in place. I think it's going to be pretty tough, at least out of the gate on this thing. There'll probably be bottlenecks in the system.
Can an event manager not hire an inspector?
Well, no. If you do that, you're going to be in violation of the law, but you've got to get those inspection protocols lined up in advance.
And Roger, there's also been a ban on some additional equipment with this HPA regulation.
That's right. The use of what are called action devices and pads by Tennessee walking horses and racking horses during competition is prohibited. Now, you can still use weighted shoes and bands. Those are permitted, but action devices and certain types of pads. So they're controlling and eliminating certain types of other devices.
And there are also some more things that have been prohibited also.
Yeah, all substances applied to the extremities above the hoof of a Tennessee walking horse or racking horses during competition, those are banned. That includes lubricants, anything you would do to prevent masking of soring so that it can't be seen. Those substances are banned.
What if a horse just looks like it's had previous scarring?
Well, they are modifying the SCAR rule, and there's different inspection criteria. And so the revised SCAR rule provides a list of dermatologic conditions that indicates soring. And so inspectors are going to have to use their judgment to determine if a horse exhibits signs of soring based on those conditions. So a lot of judgment calls are going to come into play on that.
Within your blog article, there's also a list of things to make horse owners aware of, and one of the things in that list, ill-fitting equipment.
Yeah, anything that can make a horse sore, lame, or irritated, those items are prohibited. Sore muscles from a focused training session or a small rub from an incorrectly fitted bell boot could be equated to intentional soring. And I think that's something that all horse owners are going to have to pay close attention to once these rules go into effect.
Also, really paying close attention to what substances they are putting on their horse?
Right. Any substance that could make a horse sore or have any type of inflammatory reaction is prohibited, and that includes therapeutic liniment, which it's kind of surprising that's in the rule, but it is. And you can't use any substances on the limbs of a horse, including skin or hair conditioners or fly spray.
And for these rules, they include more than just the horse owners.
Right. They're not the only ones that are liable. Any participant with horses is subject to liability, including agents and haulers and trainers and vendors and supporters and sponsors. So really, really broad reach.
What are some other things that horse owners might need to have for inspectors when it comes to them looking at their horse?
Well, any information requested has to be provided to inspectors on demand. And the inspections, keep in mind, this can be pretty broad because those inspections are not limited to simply visual inspections of a horse and review of all records or physical exam of a horse. It includes such things as touching and rubbing and palpating and observation of vital signs and use of diagnostic devices. So those horse inspections are really, really broad. And they can actually remove shoes or any other equipment, substance, or any, as the reg says, paraphernalia from the horse when deemed necessary to conduct the inspection. So you really have to open up your business to everything and anything an inspector wants, and then they have pretty much unmeasured, unlimited authority to do what they want to do during the inspection.
Can the inspector then detain a horse?
Well, they can detain it for 24 hours. So there is a rule that allows a detainment period, and that's for a full day.
Is there ever a time where a horse might need to be re-inspected then?
There is. Any horse that wins first place in a class is required to be re-inspected. That's not optional. That is mandatory.
What's the overall big picture that you'd like to share with our listeners when it comes to this Horse Protection Act?
Well, it expands to all horses. It now includes all horse events by all horse breeds, and so the reach would also extend into shows involving horses, for example, from local 4-H play days all the way to international competitions. And so you've got a dramatic increase of the scope of the Horse Protection Act. Same time again, the USDA is reducing the number of possible inspectors, so you're going to have a shortage of qualified inspectors. So under the revised rule, APHIS really has a lot more control and responsibility for inspections, for training, employing inspectors who have to be licensed veterinarians, as I said, or veterinary technicians. So a lot more government control over horse events.
Anything you're keeping your eye on as we move forward with the Horse Protection Act?
Well, always when the government expands its reach, it tends to expand it even more. So we'll see where this goes. I know the horse industry, the equine industry in general, is very opposed to these rules, and they're trying to get them eliminated before they take place. Of course, we have a new administration coming in. We'll see what happens in the next few months.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen. If you'd like to read more on this topic, I will link his blog article in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to agmanager.info. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about a disease in cattle with K-State veterinarian in K-State's Diagnostic Veterinary Laboratory and K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. Gregg, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Gregg, what is this disease we're talking about today?
Yeah, I don't want to freak people out, but it's a new disease to the United States, relatively new, and it's called Theileriosis, and it's caused by a red blood cell organism, a protozoa called Theileria orientalis ikeda.
What does this do to livestock?
It's very similar to anaplasmosis, meaning it infects the red blood cells, and then the spleen in the body recognizes the red blood cells as being abnormal, and so it takes the red blood cells out of the circulation. So the clinical signs are associated with the animal starving from oxygen. There's just not enough red blood cells to carry the oxygen to the tissues.
Is this something we're seeing in Kansas?
We just diagnosed it a few weeks ago in some calves that were they're not native here. They were brought in from the East Coast. This is a disease that was first discovered in cattle in 2017 on the East Coast, and we've been kind of watching it and the tick that we'll talk about associated with it move towards Kansas. And so we've developed a test to look for this Theileria organism. And this producer had a bunch of calves that he purchased, brought them in to feed. They started having some looked like respiratory issues. Some of them were yellow, open mouth breathing, relatively high fevers, all those kind of things that we associated with bovine respiratory disease. But it was this Theileria organism that they were infected with.
Is this something that Kansas cattle producers should be watching out for in their herds?
Well, I would just I guess our major thing that we need to talk about or enforce is that this is a true time to think about biosecurity. So for producers that are thinking about bringing in cattle east of Kansas, I'd be very hesitant without first surveilling them with a blood test to see whether they're infected with Theileria or not.
And where does that blood test need to go?
Well, we're one of, I think, 3 laboratories in the United States. So it's the Kansas State Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory and the College of Veterinary Medicine. We could certainly test for it.
If a producer does realize that they do have it, is there anything they can do?
Well, like I said, it's like anaplas, but I think most producers know that a lot of our antibiotics, especially tetracyclines, do a very good job of controlling anaplasmosis. This organism is different. It's a protozoa, and it's very resistant to our treatments. So It's not to say that you can't treat it, but it's very unsuccessful compared to anaplasmosis.
And as we're talking about this, really important to mention the Asian longhorn tick. And how does that fit in with it?
Well, the Asian longhorn tick is really the major carrier of this, and it's an insect that is not native to the United States. We think we brought it in from Japan, China, Australia, and New Zealand back in 2010. And in parts of the world where there's Theileria and there's ticks, where there isn't the tick, they don't have Theileria. So it's a really important part of it. But I want to make sure that producers understand that there's other ways to transmit it between animals in a herd. Multiple use needles, tattoo pliers, tattoo or ear taggers, anything that transmits blood from one animal to another can transmit this disease. Some flies are horse flies, stable flies, deer flies are thought to be carriers of this, and then there's some researchers, certainly in other parts of the world, believe that lice or sucking lice may be able to transmit this disease also. But it is highly associated with the Asian longhorn tick, which is a new insect that was imported in the United States. And
an interesting fact, a little unfortunate, is how they reproduce.
Yeah, it's a strange insect. They're parthenogenetic, and what that term means is that the females do not need males to produce viable eggs, and so that makes them more efficient. They don't have to wait for a male to copulate and do all. They produce the eggs, and anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 eggs a female can lay at any one time, and so the concentration of them can get very, very high if the conditions are appropriate.
How high can that concentration be?
Well, I just have a story from a person that I know that's done some studies with this tick and Theileria, and tells me that was out in the pasture looking for it and got out of the side-by-side for about 30 seconds. And when he got back in, there were over 100 of these Asian longhorn ticks on his clothing. So they apparently live in little nest clades where if you get in the right area, there's lots and lots and lots of these ticks.
Is there a concern for other species?
Not so much, not with this tick. It's primarily this tick and this disease, Theileria. There's some thought that maybe it can carry Lyme disease, but that's not been proven to my knowledge.
So no real human concern?
No human concern, not that we know of.
We've mentioned Kansas, but that it's only been found on cattle that have been imported. However, is this something that's probably more of when it gets here and not an if it gets here?
Well, the disease, the organism, the Theileria organism, has been found in those calves in Kansas. The tick has never been found in Kansas. Now, it's been found in Missouri, Arkansas, and just not too long ago, just across the line in Oklahoma, right next to Labette County, Kansas. So, yeah, our parasitologists say that it's already probably in eastern Kansas, the tick is. Again, we have not diagnosed the disease, the bacteria, the protozoa, in native cattle in Kansas. The only case that we've had are calves that were actually brought in from the East Coast.
If producers find a tick, can they send it to you?
Yes, our parasitologists would be happy to identify them. We don't want them live, obviously for lots of reasons. So put them in a container with some alcohol, some rubbing alcohol, whatever, and you can send them to us, and we'll identify them for you.
Gregg, if people have any questions or would like to look into testing, how can they do that?
Well, you can call our client care people at the KSVDL. It's 866-512-5650, or you can go to our website, ksvdl.org.
Gregg, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was K-State veterinarian and K-State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory and K-State's College of Veterinary Medicine, Gregg Hanzlicek. If you have more questions about testing for this disease or other diseases, you can reach out to K-State's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory via their phone number, which is 866-512-5650. Again, that is 866-512-5650, or you can check out the laboratory online at ksvdl.org. I will link both of these resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Secretary Tom Vilsack with updates to the poultry tournament system and the latest USDA rule associated with reform efforts to increase fairness within the Packers and Stockyards Act.
Finalizing a poultry tournament system rule designed to improve fairness.
This is a system that has come under a great deal of concern and criticism by producers across the United States. We've taken this opportunity to listen to producers about what would create a fairer system, a more balanced system.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack recently discussed with reporters how the new rule addresses concerns of poultry producers, either involved in or who desire to participate in a tournament system. First,
we were told by producers that the rule should provide greater insight into a company's payment rates under the tournament system, that in the past, tournaments would allow either increases in compensation or deduction from the baseline pay under an agreement and within a tournament. The rule that we announced is one that will end the capacity to reduce the base pay, but would continue to allow, obviously, for bonuses to be paid based on the competitive nature of the tournament.
The Secretary said producers also indicated concern about variability within payment rates within specific tournament activity.
This rule basically provides and directs that no more than 25% of the contract can be based on that variability and difference based on the tournament.
2 additional rules focused on greater transparency in areas such as capital improvements and inputs.
Producers also indicated to us that they needed more information and greater stability when it came to the level of inputs that would be distributed in connection with the tournament system. This rule basically provides that stability and greater information. Producers expressed the need for key information on the nature and extent of capital improvements that might be required in order for a contract to be renewed or to be entered into. The rule that we proposed and finalized will, in our view, provide that key information and provide stronger leverage for producers.
Secretary Vilsack said this is the latest in a series of rules and regulations designed to improve competitiveness in the livestock and poultry industry per regulatory reform within the Packers and Stockyards Act.
We began that process by developing stronger directives concerning transparency in the relationships between producers and integrators. We wanted to make sure that producers received enough key information so they had a better sense of who they were doing business with when they entered into contracts in which they would be required to make significant investments. We followed that up with a rule that provides greater protection against acts of discrimination or retaliation that may occur when producers exercise their right to communicate with government agencies.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back from the break, we'll be joined by the Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White and Bob Larson as they're joined by special guest Scott Fritz on part of this week's Cattle Chat podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, and special guest Scott Fritz.
Is there anything I should watch out for that might be harmful to the cows if I'm grazing crop stubble? And sometimes it occurs in years where it's been dry and I may be turning them in, or years where we've had really good production. What are some of the first things that you think about when a producer asks that?
I would start off that crop stubble is a pretty valuable forage resource in most parts of the country. That said, when you have certain forages grown in certain growth conditions, so if we talk about a dry year, drought-stressed forages can accumulate nitrate, so that's a big concern, at least in some of the more arid parts of the country, that you can actually poison animals with nitrate on some of those forages. There are field test kits available, and it's really a solution. You can just, if it's a corn stalk, crack open the corn stalk, put this test solution on there. It's sulfuric acid and diphenylamine. It's available. You can get it at certain places. You can't ship sulfuric acid. So if you need that, reach out. We can get you in touch with somebody that can make that. We've seen on some wet years, especially in flooded fields. So you see we had, caught some monster rains here in early November. Some of those fields that weren't picked then get flooded, and you can actually get that wet environment. You get some mold growth. in some of that material, and we've seen some mycotoxin issues on flooded fields. I guess there's a group of different problems you can see. I think the main obvious one that a lot of people maybe overlook is just some of those actual grain spills. So if you're loading the grain cart and you get a pile of corn, there may be 20, 30 pounds of corn laying there, and a cow goes in and eats that. She can get grain overload. The inverse of that is soybeans. They don't get acidosis. They get very alkaline, and it's going to look a lot like non-protein nitrogen poisoning. So it could end up with neurologic disease, and they get hyperammonemia and some of those things. So various problems. The main thing, I think, is if you've got some odd growth condition or harvest condition that year, there's certain things that would be associated with that more than a normal year would be.
It seems like in my experience with if there was a spill from the grain cart or if the combine left enough corn behind, the older cows seem to figure that out faster, and they will go find those. So sometimes you have to watch out that they're the ones that may be susceptible to acidosis going in. But I want to kind of walk back through some of the things that you talked about. So nitrate, you said some forages higher than others. So corn is the one that you mentioned. Any concerns with things because sometimes we have waterways in these fields that we want to graze out, and the goal is a lot of times that those are nice, grassy waterways. At times, they're not always just grass. Anything I should be concerned about in those areas?
Yeah, you can get some noxious type plants in there that can cause some other issues. I agree. We like to have them to be nice grass strips, a nice place for those cows to lay down too, but it's mainly a big walkthrough. You're probably going to end up putting a hot wire around that particular field anyway, so that's a good time to just do a general overview and just make sure that if there are a bunch of weeds somewhere that you don't know what they are, try to get those identified. The herbarium group here on campus is actually really good. They've got an email. You snap a picture, send it to there, and they can help you identify those. And then I think a big thing we should probably cover is water sources. So it depends if you've got a surface water source, if you've got a dedicated underground water source, just making sure that that's functioning and available and that water's there before you put cows in there.
Bob, anything you're thinking about as we go into residual crop grazing?
I guess one thing is I agree. It's a great resource. We need to utilize these resources well. One thing that you see is a lot of times when there's a lot of leaves on those plants, the nutrient quality of that forage is quite good. But the cows know that, and they'll strip those leaves off. As we get later and later into the grazing, if you leave cattle out, and this is corn or sorghum or something like that, the nutrient quality of the diet goes down. And so if you're going to leave them out there longer, you may have to start supplementing more or change your supplementation plan to still utilize some of that forage that's standing out there.
And protein is your biggest need at that point on those cows.
Yeah, the leaves, good energy, good protein. Stalks, not nearly so much. In fact, could get to the levels where there's really not enough protein in just what's left out there.
So I think a great point that Scott made, when you get ready to go in there, it may not be the same as last year. Go out and do a walkthrough on the pasture. If you haven't used whatever water source is in there for a while, go check it. Make sure it's functioning. You may want to give it a flush through. Make sure you've got good fresh water there for the cattle. And then it also usually occurs at that time of year where we're getting into freeze-thaw, making sure that they have good access to water.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.